We're recording. So I'm Edwin Rutsch from the Extinction Rebellion Empathy Circle work group, and we're here to use the Empathy Circle process to talk about this pamphlet, Rushing the Emergency, Rushing the Rebellion, Story and Vision for XR in 2020. And we have two of the authors here with us today to discuss this. So maybe we can just go around and introduce ourselves. Rupert, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I'm Rupert Reed, one of the three authors of this pamphlet. Delighted to be here. I am in political liaison in the political circle in XR nationally in the UK, and I'm one of our lead spokespeople. And I'm also various other things, including a professor of philosophy.
Oh, great. And Skeena, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Skeena Rathor, and I am, I'm the Vision Circle Coordinator for Extinction Rebellion UK. And I'm involved with Political Circle. I'm a member of the Political Circle and the Movement of Movement Circle. And I do a little bit here and there where I can in terms of speaking, public speaking, spokes work, fundraising, conflict resolution work, a little bit of here and there and all over.
Great.
And, a thoroughly charmed life, I have to say.
Excellent. Marta, would you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Marta. I'm originally from Portugal, but I live in Cork in Ireland and part of XR here. And been doing, I suppose, regenerative culture a bit all over when the group was very small, and then gradually now moving more into regen and conflict resolution, and big passion for the empathy circle method.
Yeah. So I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. I've been working pretty intensely on the value of empathy for the past 12, 13, 14 years. And so we're going to be using the Empathy Circle process. And I wanted to give a little bit of an explanation of how to do that. Any viewer can go to empathycircle.com, and the instructions are there on how to take part. And there's a little pamphlet handout here on how to do it. So in this process, one person is going to be the speaker, and they're going to select who they want to speak to in this circle. And they're going to share whatever's on their mind. We're going to be talking about this Vision 2020, XR Vision 2020. And you share what's on your mind. And the listener, you'll pause, and the listener is going to reflect back their understanding of what you have said to your satisfaction. So you want to be sure that they have understood you to your satisfaction. So you share an idea or two, you pause, and then the listener will reflect back. And then if you're the listener and the speaker is just saying a lot and you think you're not going to be able to remember everything that they're, have said to you, you can ask, you can interrupt for just say, oh, please let me reflect that. And then the speaker will pause. And then we're going to have 5-minute turns for speaking. So the speaker speaks a bit, pauses, gets a reflection, speaks, etc. And then at 5 minutes, it'll become the listener's turn to become the speaker, and they can choose who they would like to speak to in the circle. And we go around for the time allotted, which is 2 hours. And this kind of fits in with what you were saying in terms of XR is rushing. This really slows down the conversation, and it really puts an emphasis on the listener, the speaker being heard to their satisfaction. So a couple of other points here is, remember, pause often as the speaker. If you're speaking and you don't have anything else to say, you can say, I feel fully heard, and that just means that you're done with your turn speaking. As the listener, you're just reflecting back in your own words the essence of what the speaker has said. And you're not wanting to put in your own judgments or your own comments or questions. You're just reflecting on what you heard the speaker say, because the speaker needs to be heard to their satisfaction. And I think that's pretty much it. A lot of the details will kind of come up in the discussion here. You'll kind of learn by doing is always the best way to learn this process. So we can jump right in. So perhaps Rupert or Skeena, you'd like to speak to me to begin with, and I'll be timekeeper. and I'll just kind of model the listening. So just share whatever's on your mind and about your paper and pamphlet. Okay.
I'll be happy to start.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Edwin. And yeah, it's good to be here. We'll see how it develops. I guess I wanted to start because two things really. Firstly, I was interested in what you said about not rushing, and a sense in which this process might have a kind of a fit with our pamphlet, because of course we're in this terribly ironic and awfully paradoxical situation where on the one hand we're in this desperate situation of emergency and every minute is precious, and on the other hand, if we try to kind of jump straight to that conclusion and try to sort of force action before society is ready for it, it could be catastrophic in all sorts of ways, not least in that we simply won't succeed.
Okay, can I pause there? I can just reflect. Yeah. So what I was hearing is an appreciation for holding this circle and also resonating with the slowing down and just saying that's sort of what with and seeing sort of a resonance with what we're doing here, slowing down the conversation. And that if we rush XR too much, the society won't be ready for it. This is what I'm kind of hearing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the paradox is even deeper than that, because part of what we need to do really quickly is create a culture which is far more slow and long-termist. We need to create a culture which practices slow travel, slow food, and slow journalism, and so on. And we need to think about the far distant future and not just be stuck in the next 15 minutes or even the next 15 years, which is a long time by the standards of our present society. So there's a sense in which it really is about finding ways of urgently slowing down. And that's I think quite difficult for anybody to really get their head around and practice.
So you have this idea of urgently slowing down. It's not thinking of the next 15 minutes or the next 15 years, but really thinking in terms of the longer term. So it's this aspect of slowing down, slowing down, slow food, slow living, just slowing down to maybe be more sensitive and aware.
Yeah. So we've written this pamphlet. We should stress that it's our pamphlet, it's our vision, it's what the three of us are proposing. We're sort of pitching it into the conversation within Extinction Rebellion. It's not an official document. And what we're trying to do with this vision is to find a way in which we can manage to start to do this paradoxical thing of giving people a sense of their vulnerability, which will make the emergency feel real to them, and doing so in a way which contains within it or has tied to it a kind of a vision for what this society could be like if we did manage to do some of this slowing down and empathy and so on and so forth more, rather than sort of desperately in a sort of Leninist fashion trying to rush to the finish line with our sense of urgency sort of overtaking everything else.
So you're concerned about this sense of urgency and this push, kind of this Leninist kind of a push, and that you need to slow down. And I think there was more to it. I didn't quite get that, but it's just, that's kind of the essence of what you're trying to lay out in this pamphlet, is what would that society look like, or if we had that slower approach?
Well, it's that, but it's also about getting people to be able to sense the vulnerability that they have in this emergency, so that they feel that it really is an emergency. And until we've done that, we think the rebellion is not going to be big enough and not going to be successful. enough. But then, and this is something Skeena will perhaps talk about more, if we do that and people are feeling more vulnerable and they're really kind of starting to get it and starting to get that this is about them and their children, and it's not just about things that are very, very distant in time or space, then that might make it start to become possible for the kind of vision of a different society to be realized. Yeah, I'm not sure how clear that was.
Yeah.
Did that make
so
any
yeah,
better?
yeah, I get that. So I left out the vulnerability part. So there's this, there's a sense that if people can really feel their vulnerability, how vulnerable they are to the effects of climate change and life in general, if they can sense that vulnerability, that's sort of a starting point for being able to make some of these changes that need to be made. And that was the 5 minutes too. So
yeah, great.
Okay. Then I'll speak to Marta if
Sure.
hit the time. So yeah, I'm really excited to have this discussion here because I see that the empathy circle process that we're using is really in line with this vision that that Skeena and Rupert are laying out.
So very excited that we're here and doing this, because you feel like the empathy cycle, this method you love, is very much in line with what they're proposing.
Because the focus here is not on doing, because I know exactly what Rupert is talking about. I see it in XR all the time. There's this push, this tension, and it's like it's like a steamroller. It rolls over people's, kind of more nuanced felt experiences, a bit authoritarian in a sense when you have that pushing and you kind of shove things, push things down. So the empathy circle is about slowing things down and for everyone to really feel heard about what's going on for them, and kind of opens that space, that deeper space.
Yeah, so for you, the empathy circle is very much about opening the space and being connected, as opposed to what you perceive as an excessive in actions, that are just very rushed and things get left out and people get steamrolled. And
I did read the paper. There was there's several places where the word empathy did get used. So empathy, I'm a big proponent, as you can see, having sort of dedicated my life to the value of empathy. And the quote that I liked here was, XR seeks to be the transformation it is asking of the world, and that then we might catalyze the preconditions for a leap in empathy consciousness. So I do want to hear more about what they meant by that. So
yeah, you read the pamphlet and you looked at where empathy was mentioned in it, and there's this particular reference to suppose XR needing to embody the empathy to actually pull things forward.
Empathy consciousness was the word, which I agree with.
And so you're curious to know more about that?
Yeah, I feel fully heard. Thank you.
Skeena, would you listen to me, please?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a very interesting read, and I'm very curious because I'm based in Ireland, so my reality, we're always a bit behind. So I'm curious as well to see when people actually start engaging it with it here, what's going to come out of that. If you want to reflect that bit.
Oh, okay, that was quick.
Sorry.
Yeah, I heard that you're based in Ireland and you feel a bit behind, so you're always very curious to see where things are at and where things have landed.
Yeah, because I suppose the discussion of something like this would happen in the UK faster. It would be time-wise, it might happen here 2 months later, in that sense. And so because we've started doing empathy circles here, but it's still a bit of a fringe thing. It's there's one thing I liked about your pamphlet is this idea that regenerative culture needs to become a lot more central and pervasive in everything, because I think historically, you know, we all come with our baggage. And I think there's a lot of activists that still have this thing that, yeah, sure, there's that little group there. They'll do the flower and hugging thing, and the rest of us can carry on with the banners, you know. So it's. Yeah.
So I'm hearing that you are excited about the integrating of regenerative culture through everything that we do. You don't want it to be a fringe luxury item on the side, and that. But still, there's this feeling in you that in Ireland, you know, you're 2 months or so behind having those conversations as to where we are in the UK. So, you know, this is allowing you to, it's resonating with you in its uplifting of regenerative culture and where your own thinking is.
And also it's this thing, you know, I like that Rupert was mentioning this paradox between we need to be embodied yet do it quickly, and how this question of whether it's going to be possible to get people on board, and because there's that resistance to the vulnerability that we experience of people actually not feeling ready to go there. And so I think a big part of this is to bring all the therapists and healers and communities, you know, that have been doing this for longer on board, so that they can, you know, weave into, as they've already been doing, but even more so, to teach us the things we need to learn so we can hold that vulnerability.
So you really appreciated what Rupert was saying about vulnerability, and are people really going to be able to hold that paradox, and is there going to be a resistance, continuing resistance to that? And we need everyone that has some kind of grasp or specialist knowledge or experience, with a healer or an empathy circle holder, to be weaving in their skill and their care for this.
Yeah, and particularly locally in my group, I'm, you know, how do I bring this to this anti-capitalist stronghold that's got such an important role to play, but that might be a bit averse to all of this talking of empathy.
Wow, okay, so you're also wondering about how your group locally, which feels like it has an anti-capitalist stance, how we can bring this to them, and how will they receive it? And you're wondering about that.
Yeah, I was just being, I'll just stop there, but I was just being, it's not the group itself that has the anti-capitalist stance, it's all over. I think all movements have that, where there's people that have it, and it's a really important one. And it's one that, you know, in a way the pamphlet can't answer yet, but it's how does that get weaved in?
So you have a wider concern that this is, you know, this is a common feeling of that there's an anti-capitalism, or, you know, that's a common feeling in terms of the movement and other spaces that we occupy, and how is that going to be worked with, and how, you know, what do we build from that? How do we draw all of that together?
Yeah, thank you. I feel heard.
So you select whoever you'd like to speak to, Skeena.
I'll speak to Rupert. I'll speak to Rupert, because I don't know if he's done the feedback yet. So it was really interesting writing this with Rupert and Mark, because it felt like a rush in itself, and we were writing about the rushing. And yet you know, I've been thinking about it for, you know, 18 months. And so it was, again, the paradox that you've been thinking about what is our vision, what is our story, with, oh my God, and now I feel really rushed in pinning this down, still emerging, and yet I am ready to pin something down. So that was quite an interesting experience in itself for me. Rupes, you want to, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that you experience the kind of paradox that I described earlier in the writing of our pamphlet, that on the one hand it felt like the whole thing was part of some huge long process, but on the other hand it also felt rushed, and that felt ironic.
Yes, thank you. I think what it's inspired in me since writing it is, and one of the reasons I really wanted to do this empathy circle was part of my inspiration on another document that I've written is the work of Jeremy Rifkin and his book Empathic Civilization, and the ideas of how humanity is evolving, forever evolving, in its empathy consciousness, and yet there has never been such a polarity between empathy consciousness and, what would you call it? I don't have the term or the words, between empathy consciousness on the one extreme of the spectrum, and then the kind of dehumanizing and degeneration of our empathy, that is a thread running through all of our systems, so much so that it's put us at the edge of collapse. And again, you know, wow, to be living in those times and writing about them, and feeling like there is a role for us all to be playing in this is a phenomenal feeling.
Thanks. So yeah, I hear that one of the reasons you wanted to be part of this empathy circle is because you've long been interested in the work of Rifkin, and you feel that work points to, on the one hand, the arising empathic consciousness, but on the other hand, at the same time, a kind of polar opposite anti-empathic consciousness or unconsciousness or something like that. And that our society or our world is somehow divided between these two things, and I don't know, maybe faces a fork in the road or something like that.
Yeah, totally. And which is why I'm speaking less now about it being an emergency and more about it being a choice point. We're at the end of a road and we need to make a choice. And it's not really an emergency as such, in that sense. We either, you know, create something really beautiful, designed for love, and you know, give ourselves a moment that either sees some of us through this moment in history, or, you know, or is also the beginning of the end for humanity. So it feels like we've reached a choice point rather than us being in an emergency. And I'm really interested in exploring that frame, as well as I'll stop there for feedback. Yeah.
So because of all this, you're not seeing it so much as an emergency now, but more as a choice point. We have to decide whether to go down the path of arising empathic consciousness or the opposed path of unempathic unconsciousness.
Yeah. And I see XR's role now as helping to make space, hold space and make space for empathy consciousness to grow and for regenerative cultures to flourish. So whether that's through direct action, because it absolutely can be through embodied direct action, or whether that's through us being involved in living empathy, consciousness, and those values through the affinity groups in our local areas, and really connecting with land and soil and each other in our communities in a with a whole new commitment and determination to bring empathy consciousness alive. So I think XR is absolutely also at a choice point in terms of how it behaves.
Yeah, so you want XR to take really seriously the arising empathic and consciousness as its purpose, and that raises the questions of what kind of actions we do, and there are many which could embody that consciousness, but it needs to be thought through and made real. And it also means that it's about taking regen really seriously, and I think you're saying that you're not clear that we actually have been taking it as seriously so far as we claim to have been doing.
Yeah, and
that was the 5 minutes. Yep. So
what does that mean?
Oh, we're doing 5-minute turn rounds. So I was just okay. So Rupert, it's your choice. You can choose any person you'd like to speak to.
Yeah.
Just,
well, I think I'd like to speak to Skeena, actually, but can I just ask a sort of technical question? As I speak to Skeena, can I sort of engage in a sort of dialogical way with the things she's just been saying?
You can say anything you want. It's totally your choice to say whatever you want. There's no political correctness either.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Wow. Okay. Right. Yeah. So I'll try speaking to Skeena then. That's what moves me at this moment. I really like a lot of what you've just been saying, and it seems to me to embody quite a lot of the vision that we were trying to strive for in our pamphlet. One area where I think there's a difference is that more than you and Mark, I still do think about this in terms of emergency, but I think we have to take seriously that a long, basically permanent emergency, which is the way I describe it, is completely different from the emergencies that we are used to. And in order to make an emergency like that real, we have to explore vulnerability, etc. But also, in order to not make it burn us out, we have to do the things that you're talking about.
So what I hear is that you really appreciated what I was saying, but the one possible difference, or the one difference is that you're still very interested in the term emergency, but you'd like to that term to be the idea of a permanent emergency to be explored, and as to what that actually looks like, because it doesn't look like what we've been looking at, right? In our history, and that obviously includes then the describing of vulnerability, and so you're wondering, how do we bring people to that state of real permanent emergency? And one way is through vulnerability, but there'll be other ways too.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's it. Because if we're talking about a permanent emergency or a long emergency, then that runs the risk of it seeming like an invitation to everybody to remain on a sort of high state of alert permanently. But that's not really possible. I've experienced that in my own life, and what that basically means is you can't function because you can't sleep properly, and you can't think properly or anything. So it has to be something different from that and more viable than that. And as I say, that one of the direct implications of that is that we really need to think quite deeply about avoiding burnout. And I completely agree with you that on the one hand, XR has been brilliant in kind of foregrounding regenerative culture, and putting some things into practice with regard to it, like people asking each other to take holidays and breaks, and like the whole kind of structure of kind of, we have a rebellion and then we recover, and then rebellion and then recover kind of thing. But on the other hand, it also seems to me that we're really barely at first base in avoiding burnout, and actually loads of people are burning out, and I've experienced it myself, but just loads of ordinary rebels as well. And that's the sense in which I think we have been rushing the rebellion.
So I really hear that you're concerned about the viability of holding in a permanent emergency, because how can you maintain a resilience and energy levels in that? And that on the one hand, XR has been brilliant at discovering and talking about regenerative culture and the cycles of rest and action. But on the other hand, actually, the real experience and your experience is that, you know, there is burnout, there's massive burnout. And people can't maintain a state of emergency.
They can't maintain a state of emergency in the traditional sense of emergency. It has to be something different. And, you know, cutting right to the chase, the chances that we're actually going to just win and implement sort of overnight or in a few months or something our 3 demands and the world's going to be saved and so on, those chances are so minuscule that it's not even worth talking about or thinking about. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And we have to build that into we have to really build that into all of our DNA and into the way we're trying to go about changing society, and not think that by just sort of, you know, doing a few sort of actions which are going to be really kind of controversial and divide people and get lots of people talking about us, and not think that that is going to be in any kind of serious way a contribution to moving forward from where we are now.
Right, yeah. So what I'm hearing is that it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to meet our 3 demands. The likelihood is almost impossible. So what are we working towards? And XR needs to become consider more deeply what is it that we're demanding and working towards and working for. And so that begs XR the question of how it operates, but also what its purpose is, and who its targets are, and, you know, all of it. It does bring into question all kinds of aspects.
Yes, thank you. That's my time, and I feel heard.
So it's your turn now, Skeena. Choose someone. Whoever you wish.
Edwin, would you like?
Yes, listening.
Hey, yeah, I'm really interested. I think what I just want to clarify is that I'm less using. It's not that I don't feel that it's an emergency. I'm weary of using that term everywhere, because I think I'm starting to experience people switch off or finding a meaningless term, you know.
So it's not that you're against the word emergency, it's just that you're finding it sort of losing its meaning, and when people are hearing it, they're just kind of turning off. And
yeah. But also, I suppose it's born of an emotion in me that I do want people to see that it's a choice that we have to make, a conscious choice that we have to make. Yeah, I think there's 3 things going on for me within the visioning team around this, which is that we haven't faced, and it's thanks to Deepak, Rupert's dear friend, you know, that I had to go there again, but we don't feel like we've faced the deepest, darkest truths. And therefore we haven't let go into the deepest abyss, I think, that we could let go into, and therefore we haven't birthed the truest, greatest force of a a love in a time of crisis, of, you know, a crisis and grief. And, you know, I don't know if we're really going there, you know. And I have a sense of frustration around that, because I think in order to birth the possibilities and intend, so there's the two other places I want to hold along with the truth force, is the place for possibility and miracle, and also the place for active regenerative cultures. And I that though the energy that those two places need, I'm not seeing that energy being built, because I don't think we've actually got into the depths and the layers. There are many truths. I don't think we've got into the many layers and depths of truths.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that you don't feel that XR has gone deep enough, sort of like emotionally through the different layers has gone deep enough, because it's there in that depth that sort of new insight and new growth can happen, and sort of the miracles can happen. And so there's sort of you're just not seeing that XR has gone there yet. And maybe a desire to go there and for XR to go there.
I think it's really difficult. I think XR is caught in a very difficult psychological situation where we don't want to create panic and levels of fear that paralyze people. And so there's this question around how much vulnerability do we want to expose, really? And I think we have to be really responsible around our how much truth we tell and how we tell it. But I think we're being too careful in some ways. Although I also agree that there's a process and that we have to allow people time. I don't think we're doing enough thinking about that.
Okay, so you think that there should be more thinking about how to go deep, and that, but and to get it feeling, go into those dark places. I think it was the sort of dark places, and into that vulnerability. And it's sort of like, how do you sort of hold that space, and how do you sort of navigate that space, and that you want to do it in a responsible way too. And so you're just kind of thinking about that, and more thought about how to get into that space.
Sure, exactly that. I'm giving a talk on Sunday on the theme of living love, and I've been thinking about it because it's not just living, it's living love in a time of crisis, which is what, you know, we're really thinking about. And what does that look like? You know, how do we live love in a time of epic crisis and rage and you know, I'm thinking about Valerie Cower's work, Revolutionary Love in a Time of Rage, and I'm looking at Scylla Elworthy's, and I'm just kind of everything that I've been kind of working with, reading about for years is coming through in this moment. And there isn't a manual, and there isn't a formula, and yet I feel the responsibility of the vision team is to give some kind of open space for this discussion to grow.
Okay, so you're wanting to hold to this space of love, and you're actually giving a talk on it, and you're struggling. It's like, how in this difficult environment with all these forces, how do you hold that space? And it's sort of sounds like a growing edge for you, and to really how to do that, and a lot of resources, and you're kind of trying to grow in that. And that was 5 minutes too.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll speak to Rupert. I might. Yeah, for me, having worked many years on this topic of empathy, I find this empathy circle process to be a really core practice for creating that empathic way of being that Jeremy Rifkin writes about.
Yeah, so you find the empathy circle absolutely essential to what Rifkin is trying to draw our attention to.
And just yesterday, we held our first empathy cafe, had about 18, 19 people in it. And it was on the question of how do we actually do empathic direct action? How do we take empathy to the streets? And we have something called an empathy tent that we've been setting up at different rallies ever since Occupy Wall Street. And so we have a lot of experience with this. And so it's like doing an empathic action where it's actually like XR listens, setting up chairs out in public spaces and inviting the public to come and be heard, and to actually do this empathic listening with the public and others. Yeah.
So I think you're excited about the possibility of bringing this concept into XR actions themselves, and you're starting to explore what would an empathic direct action look like.
And others would be, is I've been seeing that, both of you have been, big spokespeople for XR. I've seen you on the media, on the television, these different programs. And it's sort of like going into those environments with their rules, right? And I've seen Skeena with, Piers Morgan and the back and forth like that. What I would like to see is go ahead and do those shows, but then demand that Piers Morgan does an empathy circle. Sit down for a 2-hour empathy circle, and where you have a whole different set of rules, and the rules are people actually listen to each other instead of talk over each other.
Yeah, so you would like to see not just XR featuring in the mass media, but XR trying to demand of the mass media that the mass media stars participate in the kind of thing that XR would like to do. So, say, an empathy circle where people actually listen to each other.
Yeah, and I also see this is for discussing this topic of the vision, is we can hold a series of empathy cafes. We just open it to the public. Any number of people can come, and then we divide into smaller empathy circles to have, slow down, bring everyone into these dialogues, learn the skills and the mindset, and then be able to take it out to the public as well.
So I think you're saying that for empathy circles to really work well, they need to be small, and we want to try to make sure that those small circles get practiced.
And maybe also use it for the visioning. Bring it into the visioning. And it would be nice to have some people who are in really opposition. I don't know who's, the camps in XR, like, you're speaking from one sort of a mindset, and I'm sure there's other mindsets. And can we bring the sides together in an empathy circle to kind of have these slower dialogues?
Yeah. So you would really like to have some empathy and some slow dialogue between the different factions or groups or camps in XR, the people who don't think the same way as me and Skeena or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel fully heard. Thanks.
Thank you. Right. I'll speak to Marta. Hello, Marta. Make sure you've got your mic on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, wow, what a fascinating conversation. I think a place that I would like to go with this is to come back to some of what Skeena was saying in terms of what she's saying about how she thinks we face a point of conscious choice. And I don't disagree with that. And I think it's important to help people to become clear that we have to choose whether to create a more empathic civilization or whether to choose to fail, which is actually very like something which Jared Diamond says in his famous Collapse book. I guess I see that as consistent with the emergency rhetoric, if one does that rhetoric in the right way. and makes clear that the meaning of the choice is, do we take seriously that this is a permanent emergency that we try to make less bad, or do we continue to refuse to look at reality?
So you're going back to what Skeena was saying about it being a choice, that what you're trying to communicate is that there is a choice that people need to make, and that you're thinking in the context of your permanent emergency, how is that choice going to be communicated? And you mentioned that this sort of a bit as well, which Diamonds had spoken about in his book Collapse.
Yeah. And I guess I think in terms of communicating the reality of the long emergency, the concept of vulnerability, which we were developing in the pamphlet, is very useful. And one of the things I think is so beautiful about it is the way that it works on multiple levels. So there is the vulnerability that we all have, but we haven't all realized that yet, and we want XR to try to wake more of us up to that reality. There is the vulnerability involved in saying that that is the situation, the vulnerability involved in, going on TV and saying, look, we could be about to collapse our civilization. There's the vulnerability involved in being willing to hear that and being willing to open yourself up to anxiety and the need to change and so on. There's the vulnerability that is manifested by Extinction rebels when we put our bodies on the line in actions in order to make all these points and to tell the truth and to try to wake people up. So there are these multiple sort of overlapping and reflecting vulnerabilities, and that's what makes it seem to me such an incredibly rich concept.
Yeah. So you're meditating, thinking about why vulnerability is so central and how it's relevant at different scales and contexts. So for the individual that needs to come to terms with, what to do with the information and live it. With you saying about communicating it to media, or to, just outwardly actually communicating that. You put yourself in a position of vulnerability. Hearing it, sharing it with others and hearing it, opening your eyes to when the information comes in, and then ultimately as well at actions, putting yourself out there and feeling that vulnerability in a physical way too. Yeah.
So it seems to me that this concept of vulnerability is really a key to virtually everything that XR is doing and trying to do. But if that's right, then because those vulnerabilities are so multiple and so deep, that makes it all the more crucial that we try to couple these vulnerabilities with a vision, because otherwise people will feel very vulnerable. People will feel very scared and not perhaps be sure where to turn, and then they might turn to the far right or whatever. So vision needs to be coupled with vulnerability, as Skeena has emphasized in her work, that's non-negotiable and absolutely essential. And hopefully one of the ways in which that happens is by developing an empathy, a broader empathy, based on the fact that we are all sharing these vulnerabilities. Yeah. So in other words, the vision can draw a sort of kind of empathic strength from our common vulnerability to be the basis of thinking together about how we create a better society and a world that can survive. And I think that's what XR people have meant for a while when they've said things like, we really are all in this together. And in that sense, we're trying to kind of build on that and make that more real.
Yeah. So
sorry, I said quite a lot there.
That's all right. I'll do my best. So what you're saying is, the vulnerability is very important, but in a way you sort of need almost to have the vision for it to be a rescue boy that people can, they cope with the vulnerability, by having a vision where they then know where to go with it. And that helps them feel supported and have some guidance.
Yeah.
And so then you were saying how, oh no, I lost it.
Yeah, that's the essence of it. I think
how empathy was a way of coming back.
We share empathy based on
the togetherness. To bring us into the common togetherness.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Over to you.
Thank you. Skeena, really listen to me.
Oh.
So one thing I'm with is the, doing these empathy cycles and holding them from, for various people in different contexts. It's quite magical when you do them with people around the world, which very often we do. So you'll have people from all different continents together, which is unusual and privileged and magical, because these vulnerabilities stop being abstract and they become very real. When you're talking with someone that is in Australia, or that is, a number of places dealing with the struggles there and then, and feeling like XR is something they're putting their energies into because it's this boy. It's, they don't know if it's going to work, but they don't know what else could. Then, but it's this international connection of where we can be vulnerable with each other that I find is incredibly powerful.
So what I heard is that you regularly experience the magic of shared vulnerability from people all over the world, people who don't know what it's going to look like or feel like, but they're all feeling vulnerable in the same way. And there's a magic in seeing it in different faces from people in such different circumstances and in different countries.
Yeah, and it's particularly, being on a call with someone in Australia that is telling you what just happened to their house and, all of that. So instead of reading it on the news, you're helping them right there and then. Whereas I might have an action that doesn't go according to plan, and there's someone on the other side, of course they've got my group and my affinity group and they've got all the local supports, but there's a different sense to it when it is that global.
So I'm hearing that the reality, making it real when you speak to someone, for example, from Australia, and you're actually there giving, the empathy circle magic and experiencing it with them. That's a really different experience.
Yeah. And, the vulnerability, as you're saying, we need to be responsible. And I was very happy to hear that XR was working, with Mickey Kashtan and great people working on different things. But it is also learning from people like Sarah Payton, people that have, a deep understanding of trauma and even maybe neurobiology, because we need someone that has those experiences to, in a way, tell us how can we formulate the message so that the various parts of our brain can cope with the message, without us being triggered into an unproductive state of affairs.
So you're really delighted to hear that we're working with people like Mickey Kashtan, and also you'd like us to be thinking about working with people who have specific skill and background in trauma and psychology, so that we can understand how to communicate with people without triggering people into extremely traumatic responses. Yeah.
Thank you, Skeena.
Is it? I think it's me, Edwin, right? So I think I'll ask Mark. Actually, I'll go back to Rupes. Rupes, can you listen to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thinking about what you said, actually, about the different levels of and layers, faces of vulnerability, and how we're working with so many of them, of those different faces of vulnerability, and how amazing that is. So what I'm sensing is that we don't know the power of that yet. We don't really understand that, but there's a reason, right, why Brené Brown's vulnerability talk, TED talk, is one of the most watched TED talks ever. People really recognized and resonated with the fact that they weren't being as vulnerable as they wanted to be, and that at the end of vulnerability lies what Mickey Cashton calls, tenderness. So I'm really, and you talked about vision drawing and empathic strength from those multiple vulnerabilities, and I am really interested in that. I'll pause.
Yeah. So you're saying that vision can draw strength from empathy-based in vulnerability or other vulnerabilities, and you think that actually there is a real hunger for vulnerability, or at least for the recognition of vulnerability and some kind of expression of it, and therefore there's potentially quite a lot of power there.
Absolutely. So I'm kind of wondering if we could be more explicit around the power of vulnerability, and whether we talk more about that being a gateway, just as we talk about grief being a gateway, because when we are truly vulnerable, when we know we're vulnerable, and we understand what our material vulnerability is, our emotional vulnerability is, on a physical, emotional, and then in a social way, that I imagine that blows, when people talk about, they say this to me a lot, actually, how do we open people's hearts? How do we open people's hearts to this? And I think that's what we're talking about through our conversation about vulnerability. It's about opening people's hearts. And then I'm really interested in how we meet that with the space for the mourning, because I think in your vulnerability, what happens for me, and I think happens generally, is this: we can mourn for what's been lost to us and what's been numbed, what we haven't felt and what we're then feeling, and it's both agony and also a relief.
So you're interested in exploring more this power in vulnerability and maybe unleashing it more, and you think it's clear that it connects with the power and strength and beauty maybe that comes from people opening their hearts and listening to their heart selves, and that if we do this as XR, maybe we can become even more powerful and resonant. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think that is what heart opening is. Maybe that's what heart opening is. Sharing our vulnerability, sharing our mourning, and our tenderness, So, and absolutely, it's about us all entering. And the reason why I think for me it's absolutely key that we open people's hearts and speak to people's hearts is because I believe that the intelligence that lies there is far greater and more powerful than the intelligence that lies in our brain. We know from heart science that the heart actually speaks to the brain, sends many more messages to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. And in fact, we know that the heart responds before the brain responds to any given situation, be it physical, emotional, and it will send a message to the brain as to that situation before the brain responds. We know from great wisdom traditions that, that there is something in the heart, and heart surgeons know this, that there's a place in the heart that you cannot touch with your scalpel, because it's immediate death, and they don't know why, and they call it the soul place. There's something there that is not only intelligent in a rational way, in a scientific way, but also in a greater way, in a soul. We're talking about empathy consciousness, and I want to talk about soul consciousness as well. Not that XR feels ready for that at all, but it's all linked.
Wow. So you want to remind us powerfully about the power of the heart brain and of the things in the heart which are understood by science, and things in the heart which are not understood by science, and you think that this power can be very, very great, and it's something that if we could somehow kind of understand a little better and harness in some way, then that could be really transformative. Is that right?
Absolutely. Was that my 5? Did I see the 5? Okay.
It was. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So I'll speak to Edwin, please.
Listening.
Okay. What a great conversation. I must say I am enjoying it. I really wasn't sure what to expect.
Really enjoying the conversation. Didn't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. That's what a conversation is supposed to be. Yeah, so I'd like to thank you for initiating this idea.
Some gratitude for initiating this.
And it is very intriguing the way that I can see, why you thought it was such a good idea. It is very intriguing the way that what you're doing and what we're talking about tie in multiple ways. I want to add in one more way in which I think they may tie in, which is that one of the things that Skeena and I believe is that XR needs to face more the likely horrendous reality coming down the pike, and engage more in deep adaptation. And that part of what that deep adaptation means, being basically adapting to the possibility or probability that some kind of collapse will occur. Part of what that deep adaptation means is learning to be vulnerable and daring to have a vision in the face of that, and doing it together, and being clear that there is no way that we can survive what's coming as isolated individuals. That sort of individualist, survivalist strategy is completely hopeless.
Okay, so you're wanting to touch on this term, or that both you and Skeena, look at or value or looking at, is deep adaptation. So it's being in a space of adaptation to all the difficult feelings and stresses that are coming our way, and how do we adapt to those? How do we have maybe a sense of resilience when in that, and a vulnerability and the resilience in dealing with those?
Yeah, absolutely. How do we develop resilience in the face of what's coming up to and including the potentiality of a societal collapse that we may witness or experience. Because of course we may not experience it ourselves first. We may see more full-scale collapses in other countries, which might be countries in Africa or might be Australia. We may well see it elsewhere before we experience it ourselves, although that isn't guaranteed.
So might be other places in the world that sort of viscerally experience this breakdown, this collapse, and so you may not be the first to experience it in the UK. And and how do you just deal with that? Just how do you sort of navigate that?
Because if that happens, obviously people like us will be among those who are really trying to help, or at least arguing for help. But we may not be able to succeed. We have to be strong enough to face the possibility that we may be forced, in some sense, to watch other societies collapsing, with the likelihood that that many people will suffer or die in that process.
So if there's sort of breakdown in other places, you have to know how to navigate that, and may just have to observe it and not be able to, may not have the resources to be able to do anything about it, and
or at least not enough,
or enough resources to be able to do something about it. And how do you just sit in that place and have to take care of your own well-being as well? Sounds like a sense of your own well-being as well, as not being resourced to address those.
Or even, I would say, it's clear that we'll be able to do something, and it's clear that we will do something, but that still may not be enough. I think that a lot of us spend quite a bit of time thinking about what will happen if our society collapses. But I don't think we actually spend enough time thinking about what will we do if other societies are collapsing, and in particular, how will it affect us if we try to help another society that is collapsing and do not succeed?
Yeah, so it's just wanting to start even thinking about that. What do you do if there's another society that's collapsing, and how do you even help, or what can you even do, or what would that really look like if there is that collapse in other societies? And that was 5 minutes too. I don't know, did I get that? Or
that, more or less, that was a short 5 minutes, but okay, fair enough.
Okay, then I'll speak to Skeena. Yeah, so I really appreciate how you're talking about the felt experience. Like you're talking about how do you navigate the deeper felt experience, and tying that into vulnerability, because the way society is, that sharing a real felt experience without any guardedness is you can get hurt. You can be pained by sharing that. It's like, this is too much. You can be crushed.
So you really appreciate how I was talking about the felt experience and the vulnerability around that, because it how do you navigate that with with people without, and the fear is that they might be crushed by exposing themselves to the felt experience
and sharing that with others. And it's like, you're going to be judged, you're going to be criticized, you're going to be put down, you're going to share something vulnerable, and you're going to yawn and turn away, kind of ignore you. So it's like there's this huge amount of potential for sharing a real felt experience, and just feeling pain around that.
Yeah, so you're thinking about when you share that felt experience and it's not received, and people turn away, and how's that going to be if it's not, how in the sharing of it, how much pain might be on the other end of it not being received?
Yeah, so I sense I have a feeling of fear, right? Ooh, I'm afraid of kind of opening up, and it feels awkward, and I find myself, my head kind of numbs, my body kind of numbs, because I want to stay in this sort of intellectual, sort of a safe space. So, to kind of open that that full body, the fullness of the felt experience, to let that out. It feels really good when you can do it, but it is also feels scary.
Yeah, so your whole body feels a response in that. You feel awkward and you ouch, and there's a trembling almost quality.
Yeah, exactly.
Because how is that going to be experienced for you and others? And you know, you have the fear around that.
Yeah, and that numbness too, is that right? It's like I find myself, I kind of numb a bit by kind of controlling the felt. So the felt experience doesn't fully come out in its authentic trueness. I kind of try to suppress it a bit, and you know, I can feel that quality in myself.
So you're saying the numbness is also, you know, part of the issue, because it's editing out stuff, and you know, it's contracting you, and then it interferes with authentic communication, because actually part of you is numbed out.
Yeah, exactly. And then I can feel, if I sense into it, there's this quality of fear, kind of like a bottomless pit of existence, you know, this fear. And kind of looking into that, it's like I just feel viscerally, I don't want to go there. Let me be entertained. Let me, you know, numb out a little bit. Let me go somewhere else, because it's really difficult to kind of face that fear in its rawness, you know, I mean, and the fear of kind of being lost in it too, is doubly.
So it's so scary that, you know, the enormity of it, it petrifies you. It's too much. It feels like it would be too much to experience, and you don't know sometimes how to get past that. So it's distraction, and it's let me reach for something that helps me to numb this, because it's too much pain to feel.
Exactly. And there's sort of, for me, it's sort of a deer in the headlights. It's like, I don't know how you two get up in public like you do. For me, I would be afraid of being like the deer in the headlights is freezing. You know, it's like, whoa, how do I deal with all this attention, all these eyes looking at me? And, you know, so I'm, just that's another fear, right? I can't share authentically because of that fear of kind of just freezing up too.
So that fear of feeling like you're a deer in headlights, you have a fear about that freezing you up. So you know, the idea of having a lot of attention around this and then your vulnerability feels too much, because you feel like you would just freeze under that spotlight, under that gaze.
Yeah. And I'll just finish by saying the empathic listening is sort of a way to peel away the onion. It's like right now, I didn't feel judged by you. I didn't feel criticized. I just heard you reflect back who I am. So just for me, that develops a sense of trust, and sort of slowly I can sort of unpeel those barriers to share with you. So I just wanted to say that is one route that I find helpful.
So I'm hearing that the empathic listening feels like a layer of the onion, because you're not feeling judged, you're feeling heard, and you're feeling someone else feel you, and that allows you to trust, and trust in what you're saying, trust that you'll be received. So it's a great power. It has great power.
Yeah, I feel deeply heard. Thank you.
Is it my go?
Yeah.
Marta, would you listen to me?
Sure.
I'm really moved by what's being shared, and I'm just noticing myself starting to reach the level that Edwin was just talking about, where I'm not numb anymore. And because I'm reaching that level, I can feel tears just there ready. And so this feels so potent and beautiful and real. It feels real. And so much of life doesn't feel real, which is part of the issue, right? The disconnection. So I'm really grateful for this real moment. in the middle of a Thursday.
So yeah, so you're feeling gratitude, and you're also feeling real feelings, and that's what Edwin was saying was happening to him. You feel it too, and there's all these emotions coming through, and you can feel your eyes going a bit, and yeah, and that feels quite important, that one can go there.
It feels really important, and I think so much more of this has to happen in XR, so much more. And as a I think it needs to be some kind of precondition to decision making. This is my feeling. And I don't know how we do that, because we are still in this paradigm in XR of force and fix and dominate and solve. And actually what I'm talking about, what I'm visioning for all of us are, of course, as well, and I'm also in the force and fix and solve, I put myself there too, is that I'm talking about this transition to a paradigm of care and collaboration and co-liberation. And I really heard it when Rupert was talking, and you were talking, Marta, about your experience with people from all over the world. And Rupert was saying, what do we do if we can't help people, societies that are collapsing? How is that going to feel if we can't help them? Because that's tied up in this co-liberation piece for me. There's no liberation for me until actually my family in Africa, my family in Kashmir are liberated too. It just isn't possible. And I don't think we understand that.
So you're feeling like it's quite an important thing, and that we're hitting something here, and that you'd wish that before any decision-making process, there would be a bit of this going on, and you don't know exactly how, but it would be important, because there's all this other kind of, there's collaboration, but there's also a lot of deciding and doing, and you yourself are a bit involved in that, and it's just a bit different. This would be important. And also what we were referring earlier, this connection to people everywhere, and people with feeling different experiences, because considering Rupert was saying that if you're trying to help someone or something else somewhere else is collapsing, how would you? Because the only way to liberation is really together.
Yeah, and I've been talking a lot more about co-liberation we talk about decolonizing, and I've been saying to people it's decolonizing. So that's the D bit. That's the bit where we want to say no ending, but it's what are we saying yes beginning, and it's co-liberation is a word I'm really getting very fond of this week. And just returning to what you touched on, and also the spirit of what Rupert was saying, which is that when these systems start to collapse, if we think about deep adaptation, what is it that we'll need? And I feel that one of the things that we keep doing in XR is saying, and we do this a lot in Vision, and I'm partly responsible for this, is, it's this beautiful picture of regeneration over here. It's really stunning. Look at what regenerative culture looks like. But the resilient bit of what we'll need in terms of adaptation, between when places do collapse, is we're not doing. So we will need skilled people, conflict transformation, people who can hold violence and conflict. We really need human beings who are going to be able to work in situations of high trauma, high drama, violence and conflict. And we need to scale that up on a massive, and we're not talking about that, and I want to talk about that.
Right. So one thing that is very much for you present is this word co-liberation, and how it's, we're saying no to colonialism, but it's also moving out into what do we want to say yes to? What's the big thing? And, you know, in the process of deep adaptation and all that, in your work in visioning, there's this beautiful vision coming together that is there about what regenerative culture looks like, but there's not enough yet on what actually, you know, in a situation of collapse, what does adaptation look like? What does generation look like in that scenario? And so you really believe that for that, we're going to need people with a lot of skills and direct skills on conflict, transformation, and on trauma and all the, you know, even the violence, you know, how the real grounded to support that.
Thank you, I feel heard.
Rupert, will you listen to me?
Yeah.
I got very excited now. Because yes, for me, it's, you know, I love people's assemblies. They're brilliant. But how, and a meditation before or reading a declaration, that's all good. But I think there's a space for something, even if short, even if small, that looks a bit more like this.
Yeah, so I hear you saying that the kind of method used in an empathy circle could really be very helpful across the kind of things that XR is trying to do.
Yeah. But then at the same time, there's a lot of resistance to this. And part of it, I don't even understand the whole story, but certainly part of it is that people have resistance because they don't feel supported enough. They don't have the needs met that would need to be met for them to be vulnerable, for them to allow themselves to feel vulnerable. So what are those supports? And how do we engage in the dialogue that would allow them to consider doing this?
So you're asking really, how do we give people the support or indeed the empathy that they would need in order to be in a position where they could really see the value of things like empathy circles and not just resist them?
Because I know, well, I've experienced, okay, I'm going to be stereotypical, but let's say the, you know, hardcore politician or even the hardcore activist, there's this image that is built on strength, but is built on being slightly opaque and quite rigid. And so there's this idea that if I go to vulnerability, I can't come back to this image. And so it's a hard thing to do because people really need to let go of that image that they have of themselves. And it's a very big step.
Yeah. So there's an opposition between, on the one hand, the hard politician or activist, and then the kind of softness that is demanded of or constitutes vulnerability. And it can be very difficult for some of those hardcore people to make that transition.
So I'd say, for me, I think one way is to start having political discussions like this, where you don't need to go deep, or the invitation is not to go deep. I mean, people might end up, but it's just to stay at a, you know, just intellectual level, but have these discussions, these political discussions this way. And that's one thing. The other is from my experience in actions, I've come across, you know, people so-called, you know, rigid, as I described. And I know that in situations where I've been overtly highly emotional, there's something that breaks, and then they're ready to come along. And sometimes it's very quick. So it's also in the politicians and in the wider world. How do we get close up enough that we can actually break? Because it just, and do it in a responsible way, as well, offering the supports that the person's not going to feel shattered after.
So how could we bring the power of this method into politics? Maybe it could be done a bit at a time, or we need to think about carefully how to do that so that people don't feel overwhelmed or shattered by it, but you think this is a really important question because you would like to try to bring this method into politics, and you think it could change the discourse for the better.
And I was thinking specifically in XR within, political think tanks or groups or whatever, because if they do it, then all of a sudden they give permission for everyone else to do it.
Yes, okay. So if XR kind of models this, then that might open the space for it.
Thank you, Rupert. I feel hurt.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to speak to Skeena, and I'd like to say, the last 15-20 minutes or so has been really very, very powerful, and I feel myself empathizing deeply with what you've all been saying. And I'd like to say that I feel very vulnerable in this conversation, but it's possible to feel vulnerable in it because I have the sense that I'm not being judged in the conversation, although I am nervous about what people who are not in the conversation might do, whether they might judge me or judge us. So I'm thinking already about the recording.
So I hear that your mind has gone to the recording of this because actually you're feeling open and vulnerable. It's touched you. This conversation has touched you very deeply, and you're really resonating and empathizing with the space we're sharing, and you're feeling a lot, and ready to share openly, but then the recording is there, and will people judge you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because what I'm trying to do, and what I think all of us probably are trying to do, is think and speak courageously and honestly in this conversation. And it takes courage, for example, to be willing to ask questions like, what do we need in order to deal with a situation in which our own society is collapsing, or how are we going to stand it if we have to watch another society collapse? Because some people would respond to that in a knee-jerk way by saying, that's unacceptable, you can't think that way. If you're thinking that way, you're giving up on your own society, or we're still on the other society. But actually, I think, tragically, these are the kind of incredibly difficult conversations we need to start having, because if we don't, and we simply get thrown into a situation where either our society or another society is collapsing, then we'll be completely unprepared. And the point of deep adaptation is, let's try to prepare for that possibility, because it's just too risky to go into it completely unprepared and completely exposed, and in that sense sort of completely excessively vulnerable.
So you're feeling courageous in this conversation, because you've raised something that's very difficult for us all to talk about, around watching and being part of collapse, or watching it as an observer, and the possibility that we will be doing that is not a conversation we widely have. So you're feeling exposed by raising that, but then you're more worried, which is why you're raising it. You're more worried that if we don't have this conversation, that leaves us excessively at risk, and extremely vulnerable. And we somehow need to, you are concerned that we somehow need to start to prepare ourselves. And in preparing, that might be easier than not having this conversation at all because we're too scared.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so, and like Edwin, I'm feeling this in my body, and it's tough. And I feel a bit sad about the prospect that I might be judged by people watching this conversation later for having these sort of unthinkable thoughts. I guess, to be really honest, one of my motivations for writing our pamphlet was because I think that there are a lot of people in XR who are still not really quite yet at the point where they're willing or able to contemplate deep adaptation and to really feel the vulnerability that goes with thinking, God, you know, our society really could collapse. And I think that getting people to try to think quite deeply about vulnerability could be a way of getting people ready to have that incredibly difficult realization and have these incredibly difficult conversations.
Mm. So you're feeling this in your body, like Edwin. You're feeling concerned that you will be judged for raising this, and you don't see a preparedness or a willingness in XR really to have these conversations yet, because of how huge and epic and horrorsome and difficult they are. But you'd like XR to start having these conversations. You'd like this work to begin.
Yeah, and I think this way is a way we could do that. This is clearly one way in which those conversations could happen. And my last comment for this round is, as you know, Skeena, I think one of the big tasks that you and I have this year is to continue to try to get XR to be able to have this kind of conversation. And I really do think that has to involve looking at the XR 3 demands. I don't see how we can carry on in 2020 not mentioning anything about deep adaptation in the demands.
So one of your reasons for wanting to have this conversation and writing the pamphlet is because you feel, you are convinced that we have to have, this is the conversation we have to have around adaptation, and you feel that will come in the form of really genuinely looking at our 3 demands, and that we can't have a conversation about that without looking at our 3 demands.
Yeah, I feel very heard. Thank you.
You're up, Skeena.
Oh, okay, Edwin, I thought it was you. Or it's not you?
You just
always a
you
taxi.
listened. Yes, you just listened. So you're the speaker. You can choose whoever.
Oh, right. I was thinking it was more equal than that.
Doesn't have to be.
What more is left?
Yeah, first select who you're going to speak to.
Oh, yes. Redwin, can I speak to you?
Okay, listening. So you're really thinking like what's left to talk about?
No, well, actually, it's just, yes, that, but more, I'm conscious of the time. I'm conscious of what Rupert has said about being judged. I'd gone there for a nanosecond, I think about half an hour ago, remembering that this conversation was being recorded, but I just put it down straight away. Yeah, judgment, and I've always had this issue with nonviolent communication too, that we are human beings that are designed to make decisions based on a judgment. And we do too much of that. It's all, you know, we're in again, the paradigm we're in is all about decision making via judgment. And I think Krishnamurti said, didn't he, that the highest form of evaluation was or the highest form of thinking was evaluating without judgment. I don't know how to do that, and I do know how to do that. What I feel about being in an emergency and in a crisis and in XR is there isn't enough space to not be in judgment.
So you're really looking into judgment, and there was a sort of a nanosecond you did think this is recorded, people are going to be watching, might be judged, but you're kind of looking into that you do need judgment, and you're kind of looking at like the role of judgment, and how do you have a space that you're sort of making judgments from a deeper space, in a sense, or making decisions like from a deeper space that's not like judgmental or something like that. It's sort of, yeah, you kind of like don't know how to do it, but you kind of, but you do know how to do it, and you're kind of struggling in that space.
I'm saying, how do we evaluate, like Krishnamurti said, how do we evaluate without judgment? And you know, and how often is that what's needed? You know, and sometimes it is just, of course, it's just, let's give this a judgment and let's walk on and move on. But my feeling is like, you know, we've been discussing it, this is about slowing down to speed up. This is about creating more space for something else to emerge and for a new paradigm to be birthed. And we can't do that from the same thinking, as Einstein said, as, you know, the same thinking won't create that space. So I'm just lost in so many questions.
Yeah, so you're coming back to what you originally said. You have to kind of go deeper and kind of make decisions from this deeper space. And there's just a lot of, you're kind of lost in all these different ideas that are coming up now.
Yeah. And I think in the speed and in the emergency, what Rupert is talking about, and his concern about us not really leaning into the truth of deep adaptation, is that it's really, when we're speedy and we're saying there's an emergency, if you think of an emergency, and we keep using this term that the house is on fire, let's get the buckets, then where is the space in that to not have that knee-jerk response style of acting? Where is the space in that to say, hold on a second, don't go into the burning building right now. What we want to start talking about actually is what safety kit you're going to need to go into that burning building. Where's your fire suit? And where are you going to get it from? So how do we, Rupert is absolutely right. I agree with him 100%. And I love him for it, because he is so courageous and has been from day one. Is how do we communicate with XR and each other around, hold on a second, let's talk about the fire suit.
So you're not sure. There's a fire. It's an emergency. There's a lot of stress. Got to do something, and you're saying, well, maybe we need to slow down a little bit, kind of prepare ourselves, get the fire equipment ready, kind of organize a bit, slow down. And how do we even bring this up in XR, which is maybe very, stressed about fighting the fire, and there's not a lot of contemplation, a lot of self-connection, and not a lot of dialogue about how to prepare adequately. Those are 5.
Thank you. I feel heard.
Okay. And okay, I'll speak to Rupert then. I might hit the time. Yeah, so I really thinking about vulnerability, and that vulnerability is about fear, and maybe it's about facing our fears. So I hear you had some fear about being judged, about saying, well, maybe there'll be these crises in somewhere and we're just gonna not be able to do anything, and where people might say, that's terrible, you're a terrible person because you're not willing, to take care of them and sacrifice yourself and stuff like that. So so it's sort of like, facing those fears is a big part of moving forward, I think.
So you're noticing that for me and perhaps for others, facing our fears about being judged for having the wrong way of thinking or feeling or acting in relation to this crisis is quite important. Is that right?
Yeah. And also what's coming up is, we've done a lot with, bringing our empathy tent out into public spaces in politically left-right conflict areas. And so the word kind of got out to the political right. And there was like on their websites, on a couple of posts, it was just like hundreds of critical comments, like, oh, you libtards, you babies, you this, I mean, the creativity of the criticisms is really quite amazing. And, but the way I dealt with it, I just sat down at those, and I started talking to the people. I said, oh yeah, I hear you have these criticisms. And then I would invite them into an empathy circle. I said, I want to hear what you have to say. What are your criticisms? Let's have an empathy circle around that. And it can even be three of you, and I'll just be by myself, and they all disappeared. I mean, hundreds of people just suddenly disappeared and they became very quiet. So I guess what I'm saying is anybody who's critical of what we're doing here, you're invited to an empathy circle to discuss it. And so I'm just putting that out there.
So you've had the experience of being judged in relation to, well, this work. And when you've tried to respond to that in an empathic and non-judgmental way, the judges have mysteriously disappeared. So this seems to be a way in which the worry about being judged isn't as desperately serious as it might seem to be, because the judges can't stand the power of empathy. Is that right?
Yeah, and if they take part in an empathic dialogue, I feel very successful, because I'm here to promote empathy, and I would love to dialogue with you in an empathic way, because we've had the far right in empathy circles, and instead of judging them, putting them down, shunning them, I say, come, let's have an empathic dialogue, and I really learned a lot and enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, so if you do get to have an empathy circle with them also, that's just fine and can really work.
Yeah, and then the other was if they're about your deep adaptation, society is collapsing. For me, it's like if those societies are collapsing, like we have Syria, falling apart, for me, the collapse, a large part of the collapse is an empathy deficit. So that's why I'm trying to promote, if I was, had the resources, I'd go to Syria, to the refugee camps, and be doing empathy training. Like if, because it's the lack of the dialogue, the lack of the listening with each other that's causing that deficit, is causing those hardships, it seems to me. And it's the same in these other countries that are falling apart, that a large part of it is the lack of empathy in the society that's going to cause greater harm and pain than that necessarily needs to be.
Yeah. So you think that the lack of empathy is a key cause of societal collapse, and so maybe one of the ways we may be able to prevent or slow down or ameliorate potential or actual societal collapses is precisely through using the tools that you and your colleagues have been developing here.
Yes, I feel fully heard, and we have 12 minutes, so maybe this would be the last. You'll be the last speaker. If you want to select someone, we'll take 5 minutes for that and just have a 5-minute closing.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So I'd like to speak to Marta, and well, it's really interesting actually. We're getting towards the end of the 2 hours, and I was feeling quite tired as I haven't slept very well this week. Also, maybe a bit tired because there's something kind of emotionally taxing about the conversation. But also, I was getting to the point of kind of feeling like actually I've been heard, and I don't have a lot more to say. and actually feeling a lot better in myself and in my body than I did half an hour ago.
Yeah, so you're feeling quite tired before, and you didn't get enough rest, and all sorts of reasons. And this, even the kind of conversation that it was very taxing. And now having felt, feeling heard, you feel a bit less. So.
Yeah. I still feel very tired, but I feel like maybe it'll be a kind of able to go to sleep tired rather than just a kind of exhausted tired. Then another interesting thing happened a few minutes ago, which is when I got to the point of thinking, well, I'm not sure I've got much more to say. A fear then popped into my head of, oh dear, what will I do if the opportunity comes back to me and I have to be the one who's speaking again. But then after a little while, I sort of let go of that and thought, no, actually, it's fine. I can just talk about that or about this. So you don't have to feel bad for not having more things to say.
Yeah. So then a while back you started thinking, oh God, yeah, it might be me next, and I don't have anything else to say, and then you released that thought, and you accepted that it was okay.
Yeah. And it's a lovely process of acceptance and non-judgment that we're trying to practice here. It's the kind of thing that I've been trying to do inside my own head for the last few years with a lot of success. But sometimes it's more difficult to do it with other people than with yourself. Yeah,
this acceptance is quite good, but it's something that you've been doing with yourself in your head for some years, and it's not always that easy.
Yeah, well, I've been doing it really for the last 2.5 years with some success after a long time of not being able to do it with myself. But it's really, really good to have venues to practice it with other people as well.
So yeah, 2.5 years where you managed to do it. And then it's really good to have places where you can do it with others in company.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel heard. I feel fully heard. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. So we have a few minutes. We could just maybe anyone that wants to summarize how was the experience for you? I can start. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate you both of you making yourself available for this discussion. I feel quite excited, that we'll post it, and it's just by observing it, people learn how to take part. So that's one of the benefits of it. You don't have to give a big explanation. It's like you just model it. So we're sort of modeling what I would see as constructive dialogue. And I would like to continue, holding maybe some empathy cafes where we open it up to these dialogues. And so maybe go forward as a way of, talking about this topic of the vision for XR and the new story. So I don't know if anyone else wants to summarize or wrap up. Yeah, Marta?
Yeah, I'd like to say I incredibly appreciate the, being able to do this with you. I'd also want to say, you can also, you have a lot of people in XR that facilitate this. That would be very happy as well to do it for you or anyone you feel needs it without recording. That's totally okay as well. So we've got Edwin's contact. And we're just trying, to spread the method and think of different ways and different places and different avenues where it could fit. Thank you.
I could say I'm really grateful for experiencing this as a process, but just also experiencing, hearing myself, and that being reflected back to me, clarifying my thinking through that. It's been very, very useful, and I'm really, really grateful. And I suppose my mind is going to, how can we use this in XR? How I think Marta, you touched on if a circle like political circle could model an empathy circle, then that would have some power and it would make a statement. And I think I'm thinking about things like that. But also I'm thinking about, how do we use empathy circles to create the new story and the vision? You know, it's a, in our pamphlet isn't the story and the vision. It's a question mark around how we create it and what ingredients are in that story, might be in that story. And you know, the reason the vision team has not written a definitive vision statement is because there isn't one vision. So I think empathy circles could be useful in that co-creating of a story, in listening to each other's stories and, yeah, getting clearer about what our story is. Thank you.
Yeah, I very much vibed with what Skeena just said. I didn't really know what to expect. I thought I was expecting it would be interesting. I thought it might feel like 2 hours was too long, but it didn't really. And the process was definitely more useful than I thought it would be. The non-judgment aspect was really useful. But the other thing I'd like to pick up from what Skeena said is that it's really clear that this kind of way of proceeding can be a way of clarifying thinking. You know, some of my thoughts around what we're trying to do have really improved in the course of the last 2 hours. And that's really interesting. You know, that's really significant. Because that is something, if you will, that's a way you could sort of sell this to people who are quite skeptical or quite sort of, you know, rationally cognitive, whatever. They might think, well, you know, okay, yeah, it might be used to me sort of psychotherapeutically to be empathized with, but, you know, I've got important thinking to do. But what became clear to me increasingly over the course of the time we spent together is actually this is a real way to clarify thinking. So I'm grateful for that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for taking part, and see you in the next empathy circles. We'll be holding a bunch more of these, so hope you can join us in those, and any of the viewers take part as well.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.